So this is talk 2 in a series of talks on the Faith-Mind Sutra. In the first talk, we discussed the following lines. This is the beginning of the sutra, translation, of course. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. If you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. When the deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. So those are the lines that we'll be talking about also today from another point of view. So the major point of the first talk was to explore what kind of understanding the author of this sutra had that caused him to make these radical statements. We pointed out that though the sutra says the great way is not difficult, that actually we do often find it difficult. And though it says that all it takes to make things clear and undisguised is not to love or hate, yet we find that we do love and we do hate. As human beings, how can we not? After all, isn't it love that makes the world go round? So they say anyway. So from the point of view of our everyday experience, the teachings in this sutra are problematic. They don't sync with what we actually experience. In the first talk, we explained that the sutra comes not from the everyday human point of view, which is called in Buddhism the relative, but comes from the point of view of enlightenment, called the absolute. We know that enlightenment is meant to free us from what Buddhism calls samsara. Buddhism has two categories: samsara, which is the everyday, ordinary world, and nirvana, which is its opposite. So these are kind of stand-ins for the relative and the absolute. So according to formal Buddhism, what we're meant to be doing in practice is to be free from samsara. So lots of ideas about what that might mean. So aside from talking about samsara, Buddhism also teaches that both the everyday reality and the reality of enlightenment are only one side of the truth. They only tell part of how things are. Each side is only a part. Both sides are true. But neither is the whole truth all by itself. In Buddhism, because it's so much harder to see the absolute, we tend to, reify it and put it up there as though it's the only truth. It isn't the only truth. The ordinary, everyday life that we live is the other side of that truth. It's important in trying to understand Buddhist teachings to discern when you're hearing a teaching or reading a sutra, whatever, whether that particular teaching that you're getting reflects the absolute or the relative. If we can do this, we save ourselves a lot of trouble and many practice mistakes. We have to be clear on what point of view the teaching is coming from. We know that during the Second World War, there were many very famous and supposedly enlightened Zen teachers who trained Japanese troops to fight. And what they said was, it's okay to kill because there's no self anyway, so you're not really killing anything. Now this is a mistake. This is taking some action that you do in the relative everyday world and judging it from the point of view of the absolute. Of course there's someone to kill. There's a body there that you're killing. That's why we call it killing. So even the most sophisticated Zen minds can sometimes make this mistake. They don't know what side of life a teaching is talking about. So the truth of the lines in this sutra come from that very lofty point of view of the Absolute, from the point of view that the world is both empty and inseparably connected. That's what the last line of the sutra means when it says, when the deep meaning of things is not understood. Well, the deep meaning is from the Absolute. So when you're not getting that, then the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. You know, it's no avail because it's not necessary for your mind to be disturbed if you understand this deep truth. But we have to remind ourselves that's not the only truth. That's just the point of view that the sutra is coming from. There are actually other lines in the sutra that take into consideration the relative point of view. So in the first talk, pretty much that is the way we looked at the lines. To see the lines in this way from the point of view of the Absolute is very profound, and it has much to say to us about how we might live our lives. However, in Zen, we never want to forget that the teachings talk about that other side of reality as well. The everyday, ordinary, relative sense of how things are. And this way of looking at things has to be acknowledged if we're going to be grounded in our human lives. This is not a lesser reality. It's only easier for us to see. All of us come into Zen practice seeing the relative world. That's the world we live in and think about and create for ourselves. We can be deluded by this everyday world if we do not see it in the context of that other side of the Absolute. But it's also good to remember that we can be deluded by the Absolute world if we think it's the only reality. If we forget to ground that Absolute world in the world of form and time and words and logic, which do not operate at all in the Absolute. So we see that people who said it's okay to kill, we're not getting that balance right. In Zen, if you're stuck in the Absolute, we call it the Zen sickness. You know, it's Zen students who get stuck in this because they're the ones who see it. You know, ordinary, everyday people don't get stuck thinking about the Absolute. Never occurs to them. So how do these lines look then when we give the relative world its due? In the first talk, we came from the point of view of what we call big mind, or the Absolute. It's what I sometimes call the container. Today, we're going to look at these lines from the point of view of small mind. This is Suzuki Roshi's formulation, big mind, small mind. That's how he categorizes absolute and relative. Sometimes I call the small mind the content, the thoughts and stuff that runs through our head. That's the content. The mind itself, consciousness, is what I call big mind. Small mind is a discriminating mind. It makes differences. It does have preferences. It does love and hate. So the sutra is speaking from the point of view of enlightenment when it says the great way is not difficult. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences, but we do have preferences. Does this then damn us to the hottest Buddhist hell? A way of thinking about preferences is to ask where Buddhism got the idea that we shouldn't have them. Why would we even think about that? This comes from the truth that the Buddha pointed out right after he was enlightened in his very first talk. He said that as long as we want things or want to get rid of things that we don't like, we will suffer. So what he's talking about here is desire. So preferences precede desire. We have a preference to have something or not to have it, and then we have a desire either to get it or get rid of it. So if we're looking at things from the point of view of the Absolute, there will be no preferences or desire. Why not? Because in the Absolute, everything is of equal value. Everything is the same. There's no difference. This is the characteristic of the absolute. Sometimes in Buddhist metaphor, it's called a flat plane. You know, nothing sticking up. Everything is totally the same. So if it's so undistinguishable, how could we have a preference or a desire? What would there be to prefer above something else? So no preferences, no desire. What would there be to desire if we do not prefer one thing over another? And who would there be to desire it if there's no self? Which is also true in the absolute. But in the relative world, we do have preferences and desire. There is a distinction between things. At least we think there is before we understand the absolute. So at the end of the first talk, I asked these questions. So are we meant to go through life never able to say what we want or what we like? Are we to be one of those people who, faced with a restaurant menu, can never express a preference? Are we meant to be disengaged and apathetic in life? Sometimes in Buddhism it's called detachment. Oh, no, I don't care. It's all the same to me. The answer to these questions, I think, is no. We're human. We live human lives. And we cannot be without preferences and desires. So that when we take teachings like the Faith-Mind Sutra, which comes from the absolute point of view, and we make it into a practical guide for living as a way of life that we can wholly attain, then we set up impossible goals for ourselves. Can't do it. The attempt to give up all preferences and desires is not always a healthy one. Can it sometimes be an abdication of human needs? Do some teachings and teachers misread Buddha's emphasis on getting rid of preferences and desire in a way that causes confusion and psychological damage? Yes, I think they do. Because Buddha preached desire as the cause of suffering, all kinds of desires came to be treated in a negative way in Buddhism. In some sects of Buddhism, in some countries, this resulted in a lot of Puritanism. In the early Buddhism, there were all sorts of horrible graphic rants about women, calling them pus bags and, disgusting, horrible creatures. This was because you had big communities of male Buddhist monks who were assumed to be heterosexual, and they were trying to, make women look unattractive to them because, of course, they weren't supposed to be involved with women. So one problem with this tendency is that it feeds our guilt and our self-hatred. It encourages the idea that practice is meant to be a self-help program, that we should use it to try and eliminate all the habits and actions in our lives that we feel ashamed of. This just sets us up for guilt and failure. We may make some progress, but we will never eliminate all our faults and flaws. So we need to remember that human perfection is possible only in the absolute, not in the everyday world of form and passion. So what's the point of this kind of teaching then if we can never embody it completely? The point is to help us see what is true of one way of looking at reality, and to allow us to use the ideals of the absolute to achieve some perspective in our everyday life. We have to live in this relative world, but we can see it in a larger context. We are already perfect in the absolute, that is. And we don't have to try so hard to accomplish perfection in the everyday world, because this is not possible for us. With the help of these teachings, we can gain some perspective on our desires and preferences so that they do not completely control us. The kind of desire that's likely to become an obsession and become like a sick thing in our lives is the one we try to push down. So part of that thing that Dogen says to study the Buddha way is to study the self, is to know what our desires are, not push them away and not look at them. We need to know. We can question whether a life without desires is necessarily the best life. Along with all the desires that might lead to suffering, we have a lot of very innocent and life-affirming desires as well. Maybe what we need is less desirelessness and more joy and connection to our human nature. The capacity to experience the pleasures of the ordinary world is not contrary to practice. Indeed, this capacity helps us to endure the inevitable suffering of this world. Recently, I was listening to a talk on tape that my teacher Barry gave, and in it he says, we will not overcome suffering by renouncing pleasure. Food for thought. To be free from suffering, which is what the Buddha promised us. This is what he said. Buddhism is to end suffering. So we immediately think that this means that we'll push all the suffering out of our lives. This is not the case. We will still have what we call suffering, but what will happen if we see this suffering in the context of the Absolute is that we'll become one with our suffering. And we won't try so hard to push it away and struggle against it when it comes. We'll just be with it. From the Absolute point of view of the Sutra, there are no preferences because there are no differences. All is one. This is where we get that saying that everybody who doesn't know anything about Buddhism says, all is one. This is true. But there is also an embodied self. And that self loves and hates and has preferences and desires. When studying teachings like the ones in the sutra, we need to be clear about which aspect of the self, the relative or the absolute, promises freedom from preferences and from suffering. Confusion about this point can lead students into a ceaseless, unsuccessful quest to suppress all desires. The attempt can do much psychological harm. From the point of view of ordinary psychological health, it can be harmful to always be suppressing our preferences and desires, to never have what we want, to never choose what feels good and right. This is an extremely sad way to live. Is this how we want to represent Buddhism? This way of living harms us and it harms others because it limits our capacity for warmth and compassion. We can't give to others for long. We can fake it for a little while, but unless we have a certain amount of fulfillment and sense of abundance in our own lives, we can't keep it up. It depletes us. Sometimes we need to give up our desires and preferences because they're impossible to fulfill. Can't do it. Sometimes we need to give them up because they're harmful to self or other. Maybe we want to shoot heroin every day of our lives. No, it's harmful, not only to ourselves, but to others who are involved with us. Sometimes we need to give up our desires and preferences for the sake of others. Every parent knows this. But we need to resist viewing our practice as a constant state of denial. Do the Buddha and Sang-san is the author of this sutra, do they want us to be able to choose from a menu, the chicken or the veggie special? I think they do want us to make those kind of choices and preferences. How does Buddhism inform our modern struggles with the place of desire and suffering? Actually, Buddhism teaches the exact opposite of what our culture teaches. Our culture tells us that the way to end suffering and gain happiness is to fulfill your desires. The more desires you fulfill, the happier you'll be. But Buddhism sees more clearly than this. What it sees is that desires are inexhaustible, as we chant. So as soon as we fulfill one desire, another desire arises. Thus, the attempt to end suffering by fulfilling our desires is impossible. They never end. And the quest to fulfill them is never ending as well. So this doesn't sound like happiness to me. This perspective on preference and desire should help us, because if we know that the fulfillment of one desire is fleeting anyway, doesn't Buddha tell us everything is changing, all things are in flux? So are our desires. So if we fulfill one, it's going to change anyway. So while it may feel good for a little while, it doesn't feel good forever. So if we know this, we don't invest so much in our desires, and we are better able to sustain disappointment when our desires are frustrated. That's one of the values of the teachings of the Absolute. Coming to terms with the Buddhist practice of studying the self, part of that is rediscovering what our desires actually are. Not just thinking they're what we've been told they should be. We're told a lot of fake stuff as we grow up. And we need to get rid of that and understand who we really are, what we really desire. In one of Barry's books, he said, almost always the more harmful thing in practice is suppressing, ignoring, denying our deepest desires, not indulging them. This is pretty heretical for Buddhist teaching. But that's our Barry. This is not an invitation to be a libertine and to just let it all hang out, but it is an invitation to discern who you are. And if you look at it from a deeper point of view, the most harmful desires are not the more colorful ones that we would almost immediately think of when told we should indulge our desires. What disrupts practice most often and most harmfully is the desire for our lives to be different than they are. The desire to live some other life that we imagine is more interesting. So the direction of the Faith-Mind Sutra is aimed at this desire, the desire to accept your life as it is. It is in the service of life as it is, which we're going to chant in a little while at the end. We need to live fully the lives we've been given, not long after some other life. To do this, we can't become a slave to our preferences and allow ourselves to suffer greatly whenever what we prefer is not what we get. This is inevitably going to happen. We're going to get what we don't want, and we're not going to get what we do want. The Faith-Mind Sutra preaches the Dharma of the Absolute and hopes to give us some perspective and balance amid the whirl of wants and aversions, loves and hates, distinctions and discriminations in which we live in the ordinary world. We cannot avoid preferences. We cannot avoid picking and choosing. It's important not to be satisfied with trying to eliminate preferences and desires, and to call this the good Buddhist detached life. There is a time to give up our desires and a time to act on them. There's a time to look into ourselves and see if perhaps the fact that we're denying our desires is stunting our practice and our lives. So, that's another way of looking at these lines. This talk does not negate anything we said in the first talk. To set up what we like against what we dislike is indeed the disease of the mind, as the sutra says. Today, we're merely trying to explore the other side and offer some balance for our practice. So in the next talk, we'll go on to the next lines of the sutra. This is probably going to take a while. It's a fairly lengthy sutra. Let me just read you the lines again so you can kind of put what you just heard in the context of the lines. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. If you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinion for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. When the deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail.